Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and welcome to this Decarbonising Transport Week Climate Perspectives interview. Delighted that people are joining us for this week, which is the UK's official National Awareness Week, and we're delighted to be sponsored by Trojan Energy and Mott MacDonald, and also having the support of our raft of supporters that you can see on the Decarbonising Transport Week website, which is decarbonisingtransportweek.com. This Climate Perspectives interview continues the theme of our previous session to a certain extent, because we're going to be looking at an issue related to aviation, and we're going to be talking about advanced air mobility. And I have with me this morning Iain MacBeth, who is a seasoned expert who has over 25 years of experience in this field. He's recently been working in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and he joins us from the Middle East live this morning, which is probably a little bit warmer over there than it actually is over here in the cold northeast of England. Iain has, as I say, wide experience working in groundbreaking projects in that region, where he's been creating sustainable and innovative destinations which have used electrical vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, and really getting into advanced air mobility. Iain, you're very welcome, and thanks for joining us for this Climate Perspectives interview today. Electrical vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL, aircraft uses electric power to hover, take off and land vertically. Now that, to me, sounds like serious cutting edge tech. What kind of demand is there out there for it, and how is it being used?
Good morning, Andy. So thanks very much for the invitation to take part today. And yes, it's probably a little more pleasant temperature-wise out here than back in the sunny northeast. I'm sure you've got your
don't rub it in.
Yeah. So probably just a quick way of clarification. So eVTOLs, advanced air mobility. It's had a number of names over the last few years. This is cutting edge technology to the point where actually there's very little flying yet. So we just need to clarify that there really aren't any passenger aircraft in commercial use yet in this sector. And most of the activity is actually building the first generation of aircraft. There's a lot of prototypes flying at the moment. There's a lot of companies out there looking to certify and get their aircraft airborne in the next couple of years. So it is cutting edge. What I suppose the catalyst really is, there's two sides to it. There's one of decarbonisation of aviation, which we're all familiar with, and particularly when it comes to helicopters, they are obviously all at this moment in time traditionally gas turbine engine concepts, vehicles, airframes, whatever you want to call them, and they're used for a multitude of purposes, not just here in the Middle East. I mean, across the world, people maybe associate them with rescue, HEMS, helicopter medevac type things, all those kind of services for police and enforcement duties and so on. And of course, individuals to use them from getting A to B in a more quickly fashion than perhaps you can do manage with ground transportation. So yeah, helicopter use in the Middle East is the same as anywhere else in the world. But obviously, from the perspective of what we've been looking at, is in terms of time saving, particularly for high net worth individuals. Now, it depends on the use case. There are several different use cases out there, but certainly in these early days, as tourism develops in the Middle East, we've seen it in Dubai already, and Saudi Arabia is emulating that, and will probably go beyond what's been done today in the Gulf states. But there will be, new hotels opening up in relatively remote locations that take time because the road infrastructure is not there. They may be out at sea, offshore, and obviously helicopters is a way of getting to and from these quickly at the moment. Now, the flip side of that is that, particularly from a tourism destination point of perspective, the skies are empty. largely empty, and it's quiet. I mean, that's one of the things. You come out to the desert, you just haven't, until you've experienced it, you just don't realize just how quiet things are. There is no background traffic noise. There's very little bird song. It is just absolutely dead silent. So when you're sort of introducing mobility in general, but also helicopters into that mix, you need to be quite careful not to disturb that environmental atmosphere and so on. And this is where maybe eVTOL has a particular advantage, is that if all the predictions and simulations are correct, they are going to be a lot quieter and less noise impact in these sensitive environmental areas. So we think that's the key point. It's the low noise impact and the ability to go from A to B way more quickly than you might be able to do by Jeep or truck or boat or whatever it may be. Sorry, Andy.
Say that again. I was on mute there. I beg your pardon. So I was just asking, what potential have eVTOLs got to transform the mobility sector? Because when you talk about how they work, in terms of, on the environmental side, the noise side, it seems like they should have significant potential to transform the mobility sector in certain areas.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, obviously, a lot of the early work, 5-10 years ago, really looked at beating traffic congestion. And if you sort of look at maybe Rio and Buenos Aires, Rio and sort of the South American cities where there is particularly bad traffic congestion, it can take you hours to get across some environments. They already have helicopter services there, and people are kind of looking at that and saying, okay, if we can set down close by to an individual's point of travel, wherever they want to get to, that could take a lot of time savings out of things. So a lot of the initial work actually was in an urban environment, and people sort of trying to sort of just get across congested cityscapes more quickly from that perspective. Obviously, what we've looked at is kind of widening that envelope and saying, okay, we're not in a city, we don't have congestion, but we do have limited infrastructure, and it takes a long time to get from A to B with conventional mobility. So potentially, it can look at solving some congestion problems. It can, solve, like drones are doing today. If you want to get across a lake, you have to drive all the way around a lake. It could be 2 minutes by a drone or an eVTOL. You don't have to maintain bridges. You don't have to maintain roadsides and all this kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of different potential benefits there. But what I would say is a lot of talk is about at some point it will become very cheap. You see various figures bandied around. It'll be $1 per mile, $1 per kilometer, pound per kilometer, whatever it may be. At this stage, that is a long way off. These airframes are going to be expensive. They're going to be at least as expensive, if not more so, than a conventional helicopter at this moment in time. And it will remain an expensive proposition until you get the economies of scale and start to build these concepts in volume. And there'll be a pathway to get to that point in time. But right now, it's probably more of a premium product. And of course, people need to be reassured about the safety side of things.
Okay, so what got you involved in this sector? I mean, you're clearly passionate about it. How did you first get involved in it, and how do you see that pathway developing going forward?
It's a quite obscure way of it. I've always lived near airports all my life, but earlier on in my career, I did quite a lot of surface access strategy work for various airports in the UK. So I've always been looking about how you get to an airport, whether that side of things. Now, fast forward a couple of years, when I was at Transport for London, a letter arrived on the deputy mayor's desk, handwritten letter from an organisation. Nobody ever heard of them. It nearly got put in the bin. And somebody just mentioned, oh, we had this letter from a company, Decarbonising. Nobody had heard of them. I, being a little bit of a petrol head, I kind of went, well, yeah, those guys are actually owned by Volkswagen Group, and they're quite serious. And let me just give them a ring, see what they're doing. What that led to, Design were working on a project called Pop Up Next, working with Airbus, VW, Audi, on a modular concept, which was eVTOL and a skateboard electric autonomous vehicle thing. So it could be a vehicle in the city, but it could be picked up by and then fly places. And so we did some work with those guys, and we ended up taking to the Amsterdam Drone Show and showing quarter scale model flying and stuff like that. And it was only ever kind of designed to sort of pique people's interest. But what it did do, and this is also around about the time of the Gatwick drone incident, was people began to understand what was the impact on cities from this, because actually all of this activity sits within the domain of the CAA, Civil Aviation Authority. And from a city mayor's perspective, they do not have powers in the air. And that kind of got people a little bit concerned, thinking, hang on a minute, we could get all sorts of flying objects in the sky that the mayor has no control over. And that kind of led to some quite interesting conversations. And that's where it stemmed from. You know, we worked with the ARSA over the years, the FAA, the CAA, a number of manufacturers, and of course Airbus have gone on. You know, they've continued to develop their products over time, and ended up one of the key things. Actually, probably the first person at TfL ever to speak at a Farnborough Air Show on the topic a few years ago. I've probably not something we'll repeat it since then, but so that's where it came from. That's how we got involved. Now, the industry's matured a bit since those early days. There have been hundreds and hundreds of concepts people have come up with. Most of these people are startups. Very, very few of the organizations have built aircraft before, let alone have them certified for commercial services or made money from selling these commercial products. And so I think, you know, what we're seeing now is beginning to see some consolidation in the industry, and understanding that this isn't like Uber was in the early days, not like some of the early EV startups and so on. This is one of the most regulated industries in the world. Aviation is pretty safe on the whole because it's highly regulated. And maybe the only other more regulated bodies may be pharmaceuticals. But you know, it's the reason why aircraft are safe and people feel comfortable getting on board is because of that regulation. And that regulation certification takes time. Even some of the established manufacturers have glitches from time to time, we've seen recently. So that regulation certification path both takes time, but it's not been done before because it's a new class of aircraft. So electric propulsion systems, the tilt rotors, all these things are new, let alone before we get to fully autonomous and things like that. So I think over time, you'll see consolidation in the sector, some of the big people coming in who are perhaps a little bit quiet at the moment. We know they're working on stuff, but they will acquire technologies or other companies before we get to a commercial proposition where these vehicles are actually, in scale production by certified manufacturers.
So there's obviously a way to go then, for the sector in that sense to mature more, but presumably you're aware of some examples of how eVTOLs are making a difference in the here and now, and that can sometimes point towards how they may well scale up and be used in the future. So do you have any examples of practically what they are doing and how they're being used at the moment?
Well, at the moment, I mean, if you want to go and see an eVTOL flying, there's only a few test airframes in the air, both in the US and in Europe, typically, and some in China, as you might expect. None of them have been certified for passenger use yet, commercial passenger use. But what we are beginning to see is some of the more well-known contenders starting to fly under FAA and CAA permitting and beginning to move towards certification in the next year or two. So yeah, it's beginning to happen. Now, if all goes to plan, Paris will probably be a showcase for the technology this year during the Paris Olympics. Now, there's obviously controversy and local politics in play in Paris, and no different from any other environment. I'm not picking on Paris on this, but there are some people for it, some people are against it. But they put a lot of effort into getting an eVTOL operational and being demonstrated during the Paris Olympics, and they kind of want to showcase that.
So just tell us a bit more about that. I'm interested in that. What will that be? What will it do?
Well, it's a Franco-German company, depending on your perspective, probably more German than French. Company called Volocopter, and they've been flying prototypes for a number of years now. In fact, they actually do have a couple of airframes in Saudi Arabia as well, which are being brought over for test purposes. Now, it's a small vehicle at this moment in time. It's only a two-seater. To get to commercial levels, you probably need 4 or 5 seats or more. But at this stage, it's a proof of concept. It kind of shows that it's possible, and it will show people the electric rotors, the quietness, and bear in mind the form of these vehicles or airframes. It depends on how you define them in your audience, but they're very different from a conventional helicopter. People think of it as a conventional helicopter with these big blades, 2, 3, 4 bladed rotor assemblies, which make a lot of noise. All these concepts, and volocopters is an example of it. Small electric motors, much smaller rotors, and they don't have that characteristic sound that helicopters make. Think of a large-scale drone, but very, very much lower footprint. And I think this is what people will see: is the ability to drop into locations in cities, but much more quietly and unobtrusively than conventional helicopters do. And that's the key point. It's that noise that I talked about, and also the decarbonisation, because people are aware that all the measures that cities are taking to decarbonise surface transport is being potentially could be undone by increases in aviation. So if you want to have more things in the air, they need to be green and clean.
Yeah, I mean, just funnily enough, I was just having a look at the Volocopter website while you were speaking there, and I mean, again, underlining this thing that it is, very much cutting edge stuff, but it's the sort of stuff that I remember, and it's a long time ago, going back, seeing some of the videos that we used to watch at school about how things would look in the future and how we would live, and that was very much part of the agenda, along with moving pavements and God knows what else, but. Notwithstanding the fact that obviously the sector is extremely regulated, and that's right, how far away do you think we are of seeing this really scale up? And what are about the business models that can make this technology viable? I mean, what are they likely to look like?
Yeah, I think, again, similar to the way that a lot of EV startups, have experienced bumpy paths to get their product to the market. The eVTOL industry is going to go through that as well. As I mentioned, it's going to be very cash intensive to get prototypes and go through the lengthy certification programs. That just takes time. There's no getting around that. But what we're seeing some prototypes in the air in the US. There's a Chinese company that's apparently got certification. Whether or not that satisfies European and regulatory bodies is to be determined. But you are certainly seeing airframes flying now. Now, the intent from many of these companies is to have these in service in 2 years. I may be a little bit more pessimistic about that time frame. I think it'll take a bit longer, but it will be what it is, and it's when the FAA and the ARSA and CAA and other bodies are happy that they've certified it. Now, you've got to get the battery technology certified, you've got to get the avionics certified, you've got to get the tilt rotors, all that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of different stuff in there. I think the key point is the battery technology is also needing to be done. And it's perhaps something that people have overlooked to date, is that they're assuming you can just drop one of these eVTOLs into an existing helipad, or create new helipads, or vertiports as they're often known in the trade. They need power. And again, people are perhaps overlooking this. So these are quite power intensive devices. They use more power per passenger mile than the current electric car, just because of the laws of physics to get things into the air. That means that the range is relatively limited at this moment in time. Now, battery technology will improve and range will get up as future generations come to pass. But right now, I think range is the key issue. So it's finding a business case that works where you've got relatively short ranges and the ability and the infrastructure in place to charge these up, because most of them are going to have something like 100 kilowatt batteries, and generalizing obviously there, that they probably will only go 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers, particularly when you have the aviation authorities requiring diversion, charges on board. So you've got to have a reserve to divert. You've got to have at least 80% of the original state of charge when the battery is new. So the battery degradation is going to be very interesting, particularly if you're rapid and ultra rapid charging these airframes between trips. And so this is going to be the real side of it. How long do the batteries last? How quickly can you replace them? What's the range? All of these are sort of major factors into it. And not everywhere has power available. You are going to need to be able to plug these into something that's got a fairly lengthy thing. And we've all seen what the challenges are with the electric car industry, the EV charging infrastructure. You've got to go through that as well for aviation. And it's a challenge that all airports are facing. If you're going to electrify ground transportation at airport, that requires a lot of power. You start electrifying maybe how aircraft movements run on the ground, you need power for that. So one of the key points about it is electric infrastructure and how that impacts about the use case. That is a fundamental, and it's often not factored in or discussed, particularly when you're talking about the airframes, but you don't get those things flying without that electric infrastructure. So,
I mean, the vast majority of these things, I believe I'm right in saying, are electric at the present time. Is there a role? Does hydrogen fit into this whole area at all? Is there any potential of having some sort of hybrid, whether it be hydrogen electric sort of vehicle?
Yeah, sure. I think most of the first generation aircraft are battery electric. There are a couple of hybrids out there which kind of use a mix of conventional engines with some electric, so it reduces emissions like that. And there are a couple of the larger manufacturers looking at hydrogen, and not surprisingly, they're connected with automotive manufacturers with hydrogen product. So, if it follows the thinking that maybe land-based transport is looking at, in that hydrogen is perhaps a good opportunity for heavy goods vehicles, commercial vehicles, and so on, where the sheer size and weight of the battery sort of degrades the payload, you can see hydrogen playing a role in that. But again, it's new technology. You've got to get the fuel cells, and most of this we're assuming will fuel cell. It potentially could be combustion, but most likely fuel cell. That needs, again, certification. And of course, the storage mode of hydrogen is quite key as well. Most of the activity until relatively recently has been with gaseous hydrogen. But you've seen the likes of Universal Hydrogen, people like that, now looking at ZeroAvia as well, looking at liquefied hydrogen, which has its own storage issues, energy, and so on. And you don't just get liquid hydrogen at the drop of a hat. It's not available at your local petrol station just like that. It's quite a specialised topic, and again, all needs certifying. But potentially weight and so on does play into the hydrogen in the future.
So you spoke about the certification process. Regulations, obviously a key issue around this whole sector. What about I suppose, the legal frameworks that would need to underpin the development of this as a viable sector? What kind of, are you aware of the work that's going on in that kind of area at the minute? Because obviously you have to underpin things, whether it's a contractual framework, legislative framework, how are we looking at getting that into place in order to underpin all of this stuff?
I'm not close to what the CAA have been doing in the UK for the last couple of years, but I know the CAA were taking an active role in looking at the operating environment. So you're talking about the air traffic control systems, something called U-Space, which is the lower environment, a couple of 100 meters in the air. That's largely for drones, and sort of making sure, and it is important to sort of differentiate between a drone and an advanced air mobility, which is a kind of commercial passenger aircraft. They're different categories of things, but the two do need to go hand in hand, and you obviously need to control that airspace in future. So both the CAA, EASA, and FAA over in the States are looking into this. In terms of the legal framework, it's maybe not that, I'm just, again, generalization, maybe not as complicated as thing. It's probably no different from helicopter operations or aviation operations. Maybe some of the noise profiles would fit in that, but it should be quieter, so it should fit in with those type of things. It may be that access controls might be in place for surface access and that side of things. But in terms of the regulation, so that's the key point, is that, you know, electric aviation hasn't been, so there are very, very few aircraft flying with that. There are a couple of examples of small aircraft. They're not commercial airlines, generally speaking. So that all needs to go through that to make sure people are happy with that. But you also need the design sign-off of the actual vertiport to ground infrastructure as well. What does the health and safety, the fire and security side of things look like when you're dealing with these aircraft? They are slightly different. They're going to have slightly different characteristics. So those are going to be looked at. But that's kind of really sits within the aviation authority bag rather than a legal perspective, as far as I'm aware. Now, people probably may have different viewpoints on that, and I'm sure there'll be a bout of debate over years to come, particularly if you start to see a lot of operations and people start to get annoyed with noise in the back garden or visual intrusion, privacy, those kind of things.
I mean, this is obviously a kind of a nascent area, really. I mean, what other technologies are coming down the track in the area of advanced air mobility that you're seeing?
Well, I think it's important to, a lot of people sort of go and say, this is going to be autonomous. I think that's the end game, because that takes out the pilots and cost, and also the operating environment changes. So I think in the first instance, or first few years, we're almost certainly going to see majority of the airframes piloted. So you've got to train pilots up and do all that. You've got to do the simulators, get the training programs certified themselves. So there'll be a period of time when we have piloted aircraft, and only after that's kind of been, you know, the safety case in particular has been proven, do we maybe move to autonomous where the pilot is taken out, and you no longer have somebody physically flying the aircraft. I mean, most aircraft at the moment, majority of the time, they're actually on autopilot, but the pilot is there, you know, from a safety perspective, but also from a customer perspective. People generally like to see there's somebody up front looking after them. And I think, personally, I think that's probably going to be the same for eVTOL for the time being. You know, people need to get used to that. Maybe when people are used to autonomous vehicles on the ground, they may be more happy to sort of jump into one of these things. But I think that's a trajectory. It's kind of the digitization of the flight deck, the electric controls. It's moving away from physical controls of old aircraft. You see that conventional airliners, but moving towards that, you know, sort of completely autonomous system. It can fly 24/7 as long as it's got fuel on board or it's been charged up. And that starts to change the business models at that point. That's a key point in this space.
I mean, if I can ask you to stargaze, if you pardon the pun, what kind of time frame do you think we're looking at where these the eVTOLs and the other advancements in this area are going to be more widely used? Are we looking at 5 years, 10 years? You know, what's that time scale in your view?
I think you'll see the very first commercial flights in 2 to 3 years from now. Some people would prefer to come a bit quicker than that, but being conservative, I'd say 2 to 3 years where you can actually go and book one. I think it takes time to scale up. So 5 years from now, there'll be a few more airframes around, but you know, until you actually sort of build the advanced manufacturing capabilities, and people are working on this. You know, there's car manufacturers involved who've got scale up type of things. But then sort of maybe early, mid 2030s, I think you're starting to see autonomous operations at that point in time. So you've probably got a roughly 10-year time scale where you move from the very early prototypes through to piloted, through to autonomous. New battery technologies come in, maybe the hydrogen comes at that point in time, but the capabilities change, and you're on second or third generation airframes by that point as well.
Iain, we've run out of time. It's a fascinating area, a really fascinating area, you know, for discussion, and it's really interesting. There's been a common thread running through many of the conversations and discussions that we've been having as part of Decarbonising Transport Week about the pace of change, the scaling up, and moving from innovation to practical implementation. And I think I've got no doubt that, you know, given the fact that we've got people like yourself and others involved in this sector, that, you know, the sector will actually, I'm going to use a horrible pun as well, take off in the future. But thanks for sharing your insights in this Climate Perspectives interview as part of Decarbonising Transport Week this morning. So really grateful to you for that. And I'd just like to thank you very, very much indeed for taking part. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. It's been a pleasure. I hope people found it of interest.
Thanks, Ian. And also just to say thanks to our Decarbonising Transport Week sponsors, Trojan Energy and Mott MacDonald, and a reminder that you can see all of the material, all of the webinars that we've hosted as part of the week on our decarbonisingtransportweek.com website. So head over to there, lots of information about all the people and all the organisations who've taken part in the week. So from me, Andy Walker, and from Iain MacBeth, it's goodbye for now.